Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Darius Sharpe has an extensive 22-year career in healthcare, including 3 years as an EMT, 13 years as a paramedic, and 6 years as an ER nurse. He is a dedicated fitness and health enthusiast, regularly participating in endurance sports such as Spartan Races and marathons. Despite maintaining good health, he was diagnosed as pre-diabetic some years ago and discovered a coronary artery calcium score of 44 at the age of 39 back in 2023. Since then, he has devoted significant effort to understanding the reasons behind these health issues and determining the appropriate course of action. Darius has become increasingly dissatisfied with the current medical system and has questioned why doctors do not prescribe nutrition and exercise plans to patients instead of solely relying on medication. Drawing on his medical background, Darius has delved deeply into the realms of nutrition, metabolic illness, diabetes, cardiac disease, and autoimmunity. He continues to educate himself daily and has been amazed to discover in the literature how many of these conditions can be prevented, reversed, or improved through simple dietary changes. Darius Sharpe, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks, Casey. I really appreciate it. That was a great intro. And you nailed
Thank
it.
you. Thank you. I told you offline in my practice run, I nailed it perfectly. So I used up my one good shot and I was totally going to screw it up. The way we do our introductions and recordings, like the music that I'm hearing now from the introduction is already playing. So if I goof anything up in the introduction, I can't go back and edit it. So I'm like fully committed during the intro and outro music section.
Got it. Well, that's great.
Man.
I've done some music in the past, so I know it's like being on stage and you only have one shot.
Man, exactly. Well, speaking of being on stage and having one shot, you had your shot on stage at the Collaborative Science Conference in Las Vegas. You did an amazing job. Congratulations on your presentation. I know you're not shy about getting on stage, but you said it was something pretty unique and one of the first times you've ever done that. And again, 15 minutes goes by so quick, man. But you did such a great job. How was that experience for you?
Thank you. Appreciate that. It was pretty surreal because Dave Feldman actually reached out to me back in December, had messaged me. He's like, "Hey, I'm on his Facebook group, his Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group, and I do lots of experiments and get labs done, eat a different diet, get labs done again, try all kinds of different things." And he was seeing my posts and he messaged me asking if I would be interested in speaking at some sort of conference he's setting up. And I'm like, sure. And turns out it snowballed after the lean mass hyperresponder initial data came out. And he decided to go ahead and put on a full conference and get several of what he calls citizen scientist speakers out. And, I applied to do that and got in and got my 15 minutes of fame. It's interesting being on the stage when Ben Bickman and Ken Berry are there in the audience.
That's amazing.
So that's a very, very kind of surreal experience, and I'm really happy I was able to do it.
Yeah, you did such a good job. And it literally was the 15 minutes of fame, just 15 minutes to the second. Dave was really diligent about trying to get people off the stage at the right time. Man, it's so funny. Like even doing these podcasts, we've done so many of them. We're up in the 600s. And every time, I kid you not, every time before an interview, I'm like, what are we going to talk about for an hour? I get so stressed about how we're going to have enough or I'm going to run out of questions. And then we get to the middle part of the conversation. I'm like, oh, wow, we're going to kind of like wrap this up and make sure I hit these key points. And we never end up covering as much as I like to cover. So it's always a bit of stress, but it never actually pans out.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've listened to some of your podcasts now, and honestly, before meeting you the other day, I didn't listen to your podcast at all, but I've listened to several of them recently and really liked them. And you do a great job of just getting great information out of people or interviewing people that that are kind of obscure on the fringes, and as well as some of the big names. So great job to you, man.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate those kind words. And I think of you as, somebody who is on the come up and is sharing their information, but is also already very, very knowledgeable. Before we get into your story and before I give you more than 15 minutes to talk about some of the things you talked about at the conference, which I found so interesting, I do want to ask you about something we mentioned in the introduction, which is Spartan Races. And I've done a Spartan race myself. I really enjoyed it. I decided basically I wanted to do it really fat adapted and to see how it went. What has your experience like being more like kind of on the fat burning spectrum and doing an event that most people would consider very highly glycolytic, very anaerobic, and a type of kind of event that most people would be fueling with carbohydrates. What has your experience been like on the other side of that?
Well, to just give a quick background on my fitness history, I did like track in high school, but other than that, I never really did any competitive sports. I was just kind of your regular fitness guy. I'd work out at the gym, I'd go on some hikes, snowboard, and things like that. So it was only about 7 or 8 years ago that I started doing like Tough Mudders and Spartans, and only the last couple of years that I started doing more road races like marathons and half marathons. So I'm very new to endurance sports, and it was not my thing growing up. I didn't like running at all. Actually, I hated running. So uh, I was already, by the time I started this stuff, I was already kind of low carbish. So even though I probably had more carbs when I first started, it wasn't that vastly different from what I'm doing now. Um, Anecdotally, I have tried to kind of experiment with doing some more carbs before a race, but I don't notice any difference really. Actually, I would say that one of my best races I ever ran was a half marathon last year, and it was at the end of a keto experiment week where I was very strict keto. And before that, I was only kind of low carb, maybe 50 to 100 grams of net carbs a day. But for this week, I was strictly 20 grams, and I actually did better at that race, and I had my continuous glucose monitor on, and my glucose was just flat the whole race.
Wow.
Which really is what you want. You don't want it dipping low. You don't want it spiking super high, which means you're accessing your glycogen stores, and you don't want it dipping super low, which means you're depleting everything. So it was flat the whole race, and I felt great. I wasn't quite as conditioned as I would like to have been, but I definitely felt the best during that race, and it's probably one of my better races.
Wow. But you never had the experience of the contrast trying to do endurance events being fueled purely by carbohydrates?
Correct. I've never done that.
Oh,
Other than,
man.
again, in the past, years ago, like during track or something in high school, but
Yeah.
I've always
Well,
suffered with endurance races for sure.
okay. Let me tell you, you're not missing anything. I remember back to my competitive cycling days and just like the gallons and gallons of like Cytomax and goo and all the, things you would eat just to fuel like a few hours of riding contrasted to, again, when I did that Spartan race back in 2016, I did it fasting, had a little bit of fat with me. And man, I felt amazing the whole time. And just seeing everybody around me like spiking up and down and up and down, like you said, like needing fuel the whole time. It's great that you skip that step and you could go right to the good stuff. It's
Oh
awesome.
yeah. And during my races, I very rarely fuel. Like maybe during a marathon, I'll get some electrolytes in, but even during a lot of half marathons, I don't even bother doing water. I just run through them.
Just go. Yeah, just go. If you imagine how we would have evolved and how we would have done like persistence hunting, in places that may have been pretty hot that didn't necessarily have, water tables every kilometer, every mile along the path. Like I think that suits us quite well. That we
Yeah.
able to, as long as we're fueling the proper way, we can go out and do endurance events and do that for a long time without requiring all that stuff. Which leads us, I guess, to your health journey. So you've told us a little bit about your fitness journey. Tell us about your interest in health, how you got into wanting to be a paramedic and eventually an ER nurse, how that all went and how that kind of combined with the fitness and what you learned about yourself along the way.
Um, well, I first started doing what's called fire exploring when I was a teenager. So I started out at 14 doing ride alongs with the fire department and going through like a little fire explorer academy and things like that. It was a lot of fun. So when I got out of high school, I went directly to my EMT class, and I was 17 years old actually. And so the next year when I got hired as an EMT full time in the 911 system, I was 18. So I started very, very early in life.
Wow.
After a year of doing that, I went to paramedic school and got my medic license in '05 and was a paramedic for 13 years before I went on to do ER nursing. And I've been doing that for 6 years now in a trauma center. One of the things you talk about early on, like how did I get into the whole nutrition thing? And I remember when I was 18 or like 18 or 19, I was an EMT, and we get all these patients that were just sick, right? The sickest of the sick. They're obese, they're diabetic, their blood pressure is terrible. And I remember thinking, and I would ask my patient or my paramedic partners, I'd be like, why don't doctors prescribe like a diet and like exercise plan to the patients, right? That's just what they need. They're on all these pills. They don't seem to be helping. they're still, having infarctions. They're on the statins, they're on the antihypertensive, they're on the diabetic medication, but they're still having all the problems that they're trying to avoid. So I'm like, why wouldn't they prescribe them the actual fix to the problem? And I never got an answer on that one. And 20 years later, there's still really no answer to that.
You make it sound so easy. Like it's like so obvious when you say it like that.
Yeah, and it seemed obvious to me that that was what should be done, but never in my career did I actually ever see it done. I had just a couple of patients. I remember it was kind of funny. It was the same exact shift, and I had two different patients, one kind of younger guy and one older lady. And I was asking them their medical history, and both of them said, these are two separate calls, different times. Both of them said, "Yeah, I was diagnosed with diabetes, but I figured out how to fix that." And so both of them, I didn't, I wasn't into nutrition and stuff at that time, but I was fairly into health and working out. And they're like, "Yeah, I figured out how to fix it." And they just changed their diets and were able to reverse their diabetes. And I'm like, well, why don't we do that more often? And it's only nowadays that we're actually starting to see things like functional medicine doctors actually work on reversing the disease rather than just medicating it.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm listening to Gary Taubes' recent book, Rethinking Diabetes. And it's very interesting to me to hear like the history of how we were treating type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and how, people understood that you could change the diet and that would definitely help quite a bit with both diseases essentially. And when we, invented insulin, it was kind of this idea like, okay, well, we've got insulin, so now we can just make sure people can eat whatever they want. They don't feel like they're on some special diet, and we just have enough insulin to cover it. And it was interesting to hear in particular the story of Dr. Bredesen and how he kind of found things to help him with his type 1, and he just kind of came up with his own idea of like the law of small numbers, where like if you're not eating a lot of carbohydrate, you don't need as much insulin, so it's a lot easier to manage, and you don't get a lot of the downsides to insulin. And part of what he was doing was not even necessarily telling people what to eat necessarily. He just said, like, measure your own blood sugar, keep your blood sugar low with whatever food you want to eat that does so. And when people did that, they just intuitively got locked into low carbohydrate. And it doesn't sound like people hated it. In fact, they much preferred it, especially kids, like didn't want to like stick themselves and didn't want to take insulin. And like they just figured out, oh, okay, I'll just eat these foods and everything will be fine. And everything improves. It's so obvious. People just figure it out on their own if they're given the choice.
You know what we call that? We call that empowerment, right? You are giving the person the power over their own health. And I see it so often in the emergency department where people come in with just glucose that's, in the 300s, 400s, 500s or higher. And at no point did anybody ever give them any guidance about how to eat, or, hey, how about you eat some food and check what your blood sugar does. And if your blood sugar goes really high, avoid that food. They never, ever get that guidance. As a matter of fact, I walked into a room one time and a there was one of the dietitians giving advice to one of our diabetic patients and telling the patient that it's okay to drink juice.
Oh my goodness.
Mind you, that nutritionist was obese. And as soon as they left the room, I talked to the patient and was like, okay, so I am not a nutritionist, but I am a nurse. I would disregard a lot of the things that she said. If you drink juice, your blood sugar is going to go up, period. That's what's going to happen. And I see patients time and again that will tell me, oh, it's 100% juice though. And and sometimes I can only do what I can, right? Sometimes I only have very limited time with patients. And if I could just get the concept through to them that no, juice is going to raise your blood sugar and it's going to cause you problems. I have to spend like a lot of time explaining that to them, because in our system, in the hospital, we tell patients juice is okay and we give it to them in their meals. I can't tell you how many times I walk in the room and my diabetic patient has juice boxes on their tray. And their blood sugars are high, and I'm having to cover them with extra insulin that I wouldn't have had to had they not been given that juice. Because most of them, they want it. They want the juice. They want the sweet thing. They're very addicted to that sweetness. But going back to your discussion, what you're talking about in the book, when you give the patients the information that they need, the guidance to actually figure out, well, hey, these things raise my blood sugar, so maybe I should avoid them. And you're actually empowering them to treat themselves rather than us being the people responsible for it. Because people come to the medical system, they come to the conventional medicine, their doctor, and they put all of that, all of their medical problems onto the doctor. Fix me, doctor. And a lot of people have no concept that, hey, you can actually fix yourself. Maybe they do kind of get that, hey, I know I'm not eating so well, I know I should lose some weight, but they don't know how to do it functionally. Yeah. And that's the medicine, that's the whole point of functional medicine, right? Figuring out how to make your body work the way you want it to.
Yeah. And I love that. Just out of curiosity, how did the patient respond when you said, hey, I would maybe disregard a few things? Did it make sense to them?
Well, he just his response was, I took one look at her and I took one look at you, and I think I'm going to go with what you're telling me.
If you're listening and not watching, that is absolutely true. Just follow Darius on social media. Dude is ripped. I could say every spare moment of the conference when we were in session watching these amazing talks, you had your workout gear on and you were working out, whether you were running outside in the cold and the rain in Las Vegas. Like, you were very fit, dude. I would take advice from you for sure. I've been working with somebody, who's done really well with type 2 diabetes and has mostly reversed it. He's in a tough spot right now, and some of his numbers not going the right way. So he went in, got a lipid test. His LDL cholesterol was at 92, so his doctor wanted him to take a statin. He said, I don't really feel comfortable taking a statin, so that was pretty good there. I didn't give him medical advice, but said, I think you made the right call. And then, he's having a tough time with his blood sugars. So I said, was your doctor concerned with anything else other than your cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol? And he said, yes, he was concerned about my blood sugar control. And I said, okay, awesome. What did the doctor tell you to do about your blood sugar? And he responded by saying, I just need to take fast-acting insulin up to 4 times a day to cover the blood glucose spikes. And I responded and said, so, but not like control what would make your insulin go up to begin with? Like, shouldn't we start with controlling carbohydrates? And it's like, I don't understand. Do doctors, when they prescribe insulin, what do they think happens to the glucose? Like, does it just magically go away because you take insulin? Like, what do people think happens when you take insulin?
I don't honestly. So a lot of the things that we talk about with hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance and things like that, a lot of medical doctors just don't know. They're not taught in medical school. It's not their focus. They're trained to diagnose and treat, right? They're trained to just give a medication, assign a medication or a procedure to this patient based on what their diagnosis is. So a lot of there's actually several doctors in the hospital that I work at that are reading Peter Attia's book, Outlive, right now. And I know a lot of people in our space have some issues with Peter, but, when you read that book, it's very nuanced. And, I think his take on LDL is a lot more nuanced than, people tend to believe. He does tend to sit on the side of, hey, LDL is a risk factor, you want to mitigate it. Fair enough. But everything else in that book, like really actually everything in that book, is fantastic. It's well written, and he talks about insulin resistance a ton. And a lot of the doctors are coming to me because they know I'm into this stuff, and they're like, hey, oh my God, I was never taught this in medical school. And they're asking me questions. And so when, a medical doctor prescribes insulin, in their mind, they're helping the patient. They're helping them get their blood sugar low. And when you have someone whose blood sugars are in the 300s, 400s, 500s, you know what? You want to get it low, and insulin will do it. Because we understand all of the complications of having your blood glucose that high. You interviewed another ER doctor recently. I can't remember his name. But he was talking about a lot of the things that he saw in the emergency department were vascular problems, right? You have people with kidney issues, with strokes, with heart attacks, with vascular flow issues to their feet. I see patients all the time that end up getting venous stasis ulcers, or they'll get, they just get necrotic toes and have to get them chopped off, right? And glucose is the cause of so many of those vascular problems. It just is. So again, when your conventional doctor says, your glucose is high, take metformin, take insulin, they are doing, the best that they can to help that patient. I always want to, say that they are actually doing the best they can. They're trying to do good, and they don't have the time, and a lot of times they don't even have the background or knowledge to be able to give that patient the guidance, and they don't have anywhere to send them, right? There's no health coaches in conventional medicine. Yeah, they have nutritionists and dietitians, and sometimes that can help, but for the most part, you can't get every patient in to see them. And people are just kind of left to their own devices. And then there's the simple fact that, you see so many sick people over and over and over again, and you kind of develop a little bit of cynicism. You're like, oh, they're not going to help themselves. They're obese, they're horribly diabetic, they're walking in carrying a soda and eating McDonald's. What am I going to do for them? Here's some insulin, here's some metformin, go. And, that's just the fact of the matter. I've had diabetic patients with, amputations come in drinking sodas, like full on sodas, not even diet sodas. I watch patients' family members bring their diabetic loved one Popeye's chicken and fast food, and they'll come into the ER with it. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of connection in their mind that the food that you're giving them is the reason that they're here.
Mm.
And I just, like I said, it does kind of make you jaded after a while, and a little cynical when you see that over and over and over again. But in my mind, the thing that patient is really lacking is guidance. And they've gotten none from our healthcare system, zero at all.
Yeah. Well, I certainly understand and appreciate that, and we always want to say, like, look, the doctors, like you said, they're doing the absolute very best that they can. I wish there was a little bit more curiosity. You know what I mean? Like when you started this conversation by saying, like, I just thought to myself, like, diet and exercise might be a better route than medications. I wonder why that just doesn't like become a passing thought more often. And again, it's like you said, doctors are busy and it's really complicated. I just wish there was a little bit more curiosity around that. And I certainly understand the skepticism and cynicism around that as well, which, when I'm thinking about an emergency room, I think about the reason why you or I might need to go to the emergency room, which is presumably I got hit by a semi truck when I was out on my bike, or finally caved under the giant rock you're carrying around at a Spartan race. Like it's an acute emergency that you need to deal with right then. It's more like injury related. What percentage of people go to the ER that are, again, it's an accident, it's something that happened, they were perfectly healthy, but it's just something that happens, versus the people that are coming in with the final result of a chronic disease?
Oh, hugely the chronic disease.
Wow.
I mean, I work in a trauma center, so we'll see the worst of the worst in terms of trauma. Because we get the vehicle accidents, gunshot wounds, stabbings, all that stuff. And then, we get, or your minor traumas too, the kid who fell off the swing set and has a broken arm, the sports injuries, things like that. We'll get, a fair amount of that stuff, but the vast majority of the truly sick patients that come in it's just metabolic disease. Like that's what it is. It's cancer, it's heart disease, it's, obesity, diabetes. That's what it is. That's what we see. And they're coming in because it's a culmination of all of those things building up over time.
My goodness. Vast majority.
Oh, not even close.
Not even close. Wow. That's crazy. Yeah, that even surprises me. Okay, interesting. So along your health journey, we mentioned in the introduction that you found a coronary artery calcium score that was a little higher than you liked. You were pre-diabetic. You had been thinking about, health and fitness. And I saw pictures of you from a few years ago, and you were, healthy, not as healthy as you are now. But what kind of made you go and push further and further into kind of low carbohydrate and eventually, do your experiments with ketogenic and possibly carnivore diets and things of that nature?
So I've always, like I said, I've always been at least into working out and trying to eat like what I thought was a healthy diet. So my healthy diet before was a lot of like fish, rice, and vegetables, which I think for the vast majority, if everybody ate fish, rice, and vegetables, we would have a largely healthy population, right?
You could do worse. You could
Yeah,
do worse.
exactly. So I ate things like that for a long time. Actually, for a long time, I didn't eat that much beef. I would eat like a steak if I was out or maybe a hamburger, but I'd never really go to the store and buy beef and bring it home. Um, right at the end of nursing school, um, I had come across Genius Foods, the Max Lugavere book.
Yeah.
And I was only kind of curious. I wasn't into the whole nutrition world or anything. I just figured, I was eating pretty healthy, but I could probably do a little better. After reading that book, I was like, well, maybe it'd help if I drop my carbs a little bit and start eating more whole foods, start eating more beef, which I did. And I saw like a pretty big improvement in my just in my strength and in my own personal fitness and in my body composition. Like I dropped fat pretty quickly, and I was like, oh wow, this is interesting. Rewind a little bit from that though. You said like I'd found a high A1C at one point. Back in 2013, I did just a regular blood test at my doctor, and they diagnosed me with pre-diabetes based on basically a single fasting glucose test. I think it was 108 at that time. I mean, I don't think that was actually very appropriate. They probably should have repeated the test. They probably should have done the A1C. Sure. They didn't even tell me I was pre-diabetic. They just put it in my chart and left it at that.
Wow.
Wow. Modern medicine, right? But and again, I never have been like obese at any point. I think my highest weight ever was like 192. And that was, I was a little bit overweight. That was like right at the end of nursing school after eating lots of cookies to get me through that last semester. But one of the interesting things that I found was in nursing school, we did like the very first semester, we were introduced to glucometers, which is funny because I'd been using them for years as a paramedic before that. But our first time using them, we all checked our own blood sugar. And, everybody, the left and right of me was coming back in the 80s, 90s, something like that. I checked mine and it's 126. And I'm like, 126? And this was probably hour and a half or so after my breakfast. And my breakfast that morning was a smoothie that I made all the time. And the smoothie was just whole milk, frozen fruit, and I think I put some unsweetened peanut butter in there. And, that was it. And I think it took some vitamins or something like that. But I didn't, it wasn't juice. It wasn't added sugar. But my glucose was still in the 120s. I'm like, this is weird. I kind of just blew it off after that. Went through nursing school, read that book, started doing low carb. And again, it wasn't like super strict low carb. I wasn't counting calories. I wasn't counting macros. I was just kind of loosely tracking my carbs. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to be eating tons of rice and oatmeal and bread and pasta and all that stuff. And so I did that for about a good year, as I just right around the time I got my first nursing job. And like one night I was getting off work and I had a hankering for In-N-Out burger. And I was like, you know what? I've been good. I'm going to go reward myself. And so this is like 11 o'clock at night. I went down to In-N-Out, got myself a burger, fries, and a root beer. Full bore, right? I mean, meanwhile, keep in mind, this is something that I've eaten countless times in my life. And so I had that. I started driving home. I had about an hour commute. And I was like, man, 10 minutes later, I'm like, I feel like garbage. And so I'm like, I wonder what my glucose is. So I had a glucometer at home. I get home, I check it, and it comes back at 253. Which if if a patient walked into my ER and their blood sugar is in the 200s, I'm like, hey, your blood sugar's high. What did you eat before you came in? Are you taking your metformin? I'd be kind of scolding them a little bit. But, this was me at this time. And I'm like, what the heck's going on? Why is my blood sugar so high? And I had done several tests that, following that up. I'd had pizza other times and different things and found that my glucose was going into the 200s regularly. with these things. And mind you, I was only like moderately low carb. I wasn't ketogenic by any stretch. And there were plenty of days that I had plenty of carbs. So this was not like an adaptation issue. This was clearly something going on with me, that my glucose was going quite high. Fast forward some years later, and I ended up getting a CGM last year. And after I'd kind of gotten more into the nutrition stuff, I'd done my labs and noticed that I was the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. And through all the different podcasts and videos I've been listening to, I came across Dave Feldman and his group. And so I joined that group and started learning more. Got the CGM last year and did a bunch of experiments. And actually, I can show you the slides of that.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love to, as you're kind of pulling that up, I would love to explain two things just so the audience doesn't miss it. I would like you to explain what is the problem with having your blood sugar go up above the 200s. And I would love to hear you explain the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype.
Okay. Before I get to that, so I'll show you some of the slides here. And so can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So it was 251 when I came home and checked my sugar. And I'd done actually a subsequent experiment where I had dropped the carbs each time, returned to that in and out after my shift. And I dropped the soda at one point, it came back to 204. I dropped the bun and had a lettuce wrap, came back at 142 an hour later. And then I just had 2 burgers, lettuce wrapped with 2 patties, and it came back at 113. So
if you're listening and not watching, I'm seeing slides, and we'll tag this in the show notes. Go to YouTube so you can see these slides. It's always really fascinating. But I'm seeing all these delicious looking hamburgers with decreasingly lower and lower and lower amounts of carbohydrate as you drop the shake, and then you drop the bun, and then you drop the fries, which In-N-Out fries are very good, by the way.
Lots of I think they found a bunch of was it cadmium or something, some heavy metal in them or something recently.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, good thing I haven't had them in years. So
right. And so again, last year I ended up doing some CGM experiments, and this is a busy slide here, but you can see, and for those who aren't watching this, I checked out. I had a Pepsi, and it brought me into the 200s. I had some pancakes, brought me up in the 170s. Just a single dinner roll brought me in the 200s. Rice was bringing me up to 190s. A bowl of clam chowder brought me up to 179, which is, very bizarre to see something like clam chowder do that. Even like healthy things like sweet potatoes or watermelon were bringing me up into the 170s. I did another experiment where I didn't have my CGM on, but I'd have my glucometer with me, and I ate a banana on just an empty stomach, just a single banana that was ripe. And it took me from 108 up to 179. So yeah, huge spikes in glucose. And then I at one point repeated that In-N-Out experiment. And where was this? Actually, I will slow it this way. I had repeated the In-N-Out experiment with the CGM, and it came back at 299. Yeah, if you can look at that. My CGM went up to 299 and my glucometer went up to 265. Just ginormous spikes. So there are the name for this is postprandial glucose. And like you were saying, last year I went and had a CAC score done, and it came back at 44, which for my age range is in the 99th percentile. I shouldn't be at age 39 having any calcium, actually. But I was when I found this out, I'm like, okay, what's going on? Well, like you said, I am a lean mass hyperresponder, which means I have high HDL cholesterol, the quote unquote good cholesterol, low triglycerides, and very high LDL. My LDL typically is in the high 200s, low 300s. That's normal for me. So conventional medicine would say that obviously, my LDL should be lower, and that's the reason for my heart disease. And, I think a lot of people in our low carb community, it's become a thing where, you get a badge of honor if your LDL is super high. And, you know, it needs to be understood with some context, with some nuance. Maybe there's plenty of data out there that say that LDL is associated with heart disease. There's, I think it's impossible to ignore that data. But what is the reason for that, right? Our body manufactures this LDL. So why would our body make something that's killing us? And, Dave Feldman, if anybody's interested, can go and, he talks about the lipid energy model. And I won't go into that here, but basically the idea is that if you're eating a low carb diet, you end up metabolizing fat stores for your energy stores instead of using carbohydrates. So you end up exporting what's called VLDL from your liver to supply energy for your body, and you end up having a lot more LDL particles left over after all that VLDL disperses this triglyceride to provide your cells with energy. For me, when I started looking into this, I'm like, okay, well, why would my CAC score be high while some people who have a high LDL don't have an elevated CAC score? And a lot of those people are eating ketogenic diets. And again, I really was never like ketogenic until very recently, like really within this past year, that I experiment with actually having my carbs at like 20 grams net or less. Prior to that, I was just kind of like low carb, and even then I was still pretty, I was still pretty loose on it. I'm a fit guy, so why would I care that much, right? I'm not obese. I feel like I look muscular, I'm lean. I don't need to worry about it that much. It turns out I should have worried about it more, because as I was getting to, the postprandial hyperglycemia actually has all kinds of implications for damage to your LDL particles. And the thing that we do know about LDL is modified and oxidized LDL particles do associate or do cause vascular inflammation and vascular damage. And since I'm getting these glucose spikes, and I've probably had these going on again, I've probably had these going on forever, for as long as I've known. And I think it's mostly genetic with me. But when you have glucose spikes that high, it causes all kinds of issues. And I'll share this slide I have with you. I did a lot of labs and stuff since this has happened, and to see what goes on with my insulin and glucose spike. So I actually have this slide right here I'll show. And for those who can't see it, I did a week of ketogenic diet where I was eating about 20 grams of carbs a day. And my glucose at the end of that, my baseline was about 80 milligrams per deciliter. I did an oral glucose tolerance test with a 75-gram glucose drink at the end of this. Glucose spiked super high. It was up, I think almost to about 230, 235. Plummeted right down afterwards. I was well within the, I didn't like it. Per the oral glucose tolerance test, I was not diabetic or even pre-diabetic. I actually passed the oral glucose tolerance test, where a lot of people like Ben Bickman will say, if you're eating a ketogenic or low carb diet, a lot of people won't pass the oral glucose tolerance test.
That's right.
I do, because I'm very insulin sensitive. I think what ends up happening is people who are ketogenic sometimes still aren't quite so insulin sensitive. So when they do an oral glucose tolerance test, they will see their glucose stay a little bit higher longer, and they end up not passing it. But to mind you, these tests are designed to be done with carbohydrates in the diet. It actually is in the guidelines to have a patient eating carbohydrates for the days leading up to the test. So the second week, I did a high carb week where I was eating probably about 300 grams of net carbs a day. I did the oral glucose tolerance test. My baseline glucose was higher, about 95. My oral glucose tolerance test had a much lower peak, actually, just a little bit below 200. So that shows that there's a little bit to do with preformed insulin storage in your pancreas, so that when you do have carbs, it brings your glucose down quicker. So that's called first phase insulin response. I checked insulin at the same time as well. And here's the thing. You can see with my glucose going really higher on this graph, it shows that the comparison between the 2 weeks. when I had the oral glucose tolerance test, after the keto diet, my glucose was again about peaked around 200 or so at the 30-minute mark. My insulin also had a higher peak at the end of the keto week with the oral glucose tolerance test, as compared to the high carb week. So when you're having high glucose spikes, you're going to have a high insulin spike. That's what's going to happen. When I did my labs at the end of both of these weeks, at the end of the high carb week, my fasting insulin was higher. So my insulin had to stay higher to keep my glucose lower, because the body wants to be in homeostasis. The body never wants your glucose to be as high as people are constantly making it. When you drink sodas, when you eat bread, when you eat pasta and cereal, I think these things are happening to people a lot, and not everybody. I think there's a lot of genetic and adaptation factors that play into how high someone's glucose will go after hypercarbohydrate meals. But still, when you have these big giant spikes, you're going to have vascular problems. Really, you're going to increase your insulin, you're going to increase your fasting, again, your postprandial insulin and your fasting insulin. And here's really the big thing about it. You're going to have all kinds of other issues from hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia is like the biggest problem in our medical system with diabetes, with pre-diabetes. It causes all kinds of vascular damage. And I have all these, I can give the citations for these afterwards, but like I was reading several studies that show it caught like just having even brief postprandial hyperglycemia, and I'm defining that really as anything over 140 milligrams per deciliter, it's going to cause damage to your glycocalyx. They can see in an acute setting, like your glucose goes high, they can see within an hour or two actual damage to your glycocalyx. They can measure it in your blood. When you have even transiently high glucose, it causes a reduction up to 50% reduction in your endothelial progenitor cells, and those are the cells that float around in your bloodstream that are actually responsible for healing damaged blood vessels. So if you damage your blood vessels, say you strip your glycocalyx, you cause all kinds of inflammatory damage through all kinds of means, right? It could be high glucose, it could be smog, it could be smoking, it could be exercise. But if you have high glucose, it actually reduces the amount of cells that are available to heal that area, because those cells, is the job of the endothelial progenitor cells is to float around, latch on to the areas of damage, and actually heal over it. If you've read Malcolm Kendrick's book, The Clot Thickens, he talks about this process happening where there's damage to the blood vessel, a clot forms because your blood vessels don't want to rupture. Right? If your blood vessel ruptures, you die. If your arteries rupture, you die. So a clot will form in that area, and these endothelial progenitor cells will come along and heal over where that clot is. And that's why we find in blood vessels with atherosclerosis, you see kind of a layering, and you see a clot even in the middle of the different layers. One big thing that people talk about is fructose, and being a problem for people, right? Fatty liver, we always think about, and visceral fat being a problem of too much fructose in the diet. And I think obviously a lot of us consider things like high fructose corn syrup a problem. However, there's something called the polyol pathway that really kicks into gear when your glucose is high. And you will produce a ton of fructose endogenously. So if I eat a bunch of sugar, even if it was straight glucose and no fructose in it, I will overproduce fructose because the body is trying to get rid of all that glucose. There's only certain things you can do with glucose in your bloodstream, right? You're either going to burn it, or you're going to store it as glycogen, or you're going to convert it into fat. One of the other things that you can do with it, though, is it'll get shuttled into this polyol pathway in the mitochondria and actually get turned into fructose, because fructose doesn't raise blood glucose, and it's actually less damaging for the body. But an overabundance of it is going to cause things like fatty liver, visceral fat buildup, fatty pancreas.
That's right.
And obviously one of the bigger things that we see with people who are diabetic, you get microvascular damage, particularly, like I said, in the toes, that we see people get amputated all the time. We see microvascular damage to the kidneys and the eyes. That polyol pathway often gets what's called sorbitol accumulation, because the cells in the eyes and the cells in the kidneys actually can't get rid of sorbitol, because the pathway works from basically glucose getting converted into sorbitol, getting converted into fructose. Well, certain cells don't have the ability to convert all that sorbitol into fructose, so the kidneys and the eyes get damaged quite a bit, and that's why we end up seeing people with diabetes end up with renal failure and with blindness, with macular degeneration. This is also where I think my issue with my CAC score comes from. All those times that I was spiking my glucose super high and completely unaware of it because I was fit and healthy and lean, I was oxidizing all of my lipoproteins. And as you know, I have a heck of a lot of lipoproteins. My particle number is high. My my LDL-C is high. And even though they're the quote unquote large fluffy ones, I can still modify and oxidize those ones if my glucose is spiking into the 200s all the time. That's where I personally think the root of my elevated CAC score is coming from.
That was so well explained. I would just encourage anybody who's listening or watching, if that didn't make sense to you, go back and listen to that again. It was so important and very, very well explained. In the tradition, this is where the nuance comes in. Like you were saying before, like in the traditional paradigm, we think that the high cholesterol causes heart disease as the primary cause. And kind of what you're alluding to is, yes, it's part of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing. You walking around with a high LDL cholesterol may not be as concerning, minus some of those excursions that you were showing with your blood sugar. And again, for the listener, like I'm seeing these graphs, and like if you were designing a wicked roller coaster that I would never want to ride because I'm really lame and I'm not much an adrenaline junkie, you're designing amazing roller coasters at a huge crest and a huge drop off afterwards. And you get back to a baseline eventually, but you're saying that those excursions over and over and over, the sugar accumulating in the blood for a time is what is causing damage, which is then part of the puzzle of getting, that fixed over, like you explained, or having your LDL particles be in circulation for too long. And that's where the damage comes in.
Yeah. And, I was looking at this and I was trying to figure out, okay, is it the peak that's the problem? Is it the area under the curve of elevated glucose? And it turns out, yes, kind of the both of those. But not only that, but it actually, the rate of glucose rise is damaging in and of itself. So the faster it goes up, the more damage, the more oxidative stress that you end up having, just from the speed of it.
Wow.
Yeah, and this graph, just page right here, just so everyone knows, like, a lot of people will say, well, your glucose is going that high because you're insulin resistant. And I just wanted to reiterate the fact that my insulin resistance scores are all pristine. Like at the bottom of this page here, I'll list them off here. My HOMA IR is 0.8, kind of on average over the past 3 years. My LPIR score, it's a proprietary test done by LabCorp. That is 0. My fasting insulin is about 3.9. I have a type 1 Kraft pattern. I've passed my oral glucose tolerance test, both on and off keto. And this is one of Ben Bickman's tests that he likes, the AdipoIR score, which is 1.32. These are all very low, show me to be very insulin sensitive. So that's clearly not the issue that's going on with me. And like I was saying before, even though I had a lower glucose spike with when I was eating carbs, I was still getting pretty large spikes. And you can see right here, this is on the right side is my high carb week. This is the oral glucose tolerance test at the top here, starting that high carb week. And then just a couple hours later, I end up having some Indian food. And that I used to get on the ambulance all the time because I loved eating there. And you saw I had a pretty big spike in glucose there. And all over that whole week, I had large spikes above 150 up into the 180s very often. And so it clearly isn't, an adaptation thing. I just have high glucose spikes. Now, there are certain genes that I've checked out that seem to make me more likely to have spikes like this. I guess one of the genes that I have that I'm homozygous for essentially keeps what are called the GLUT4 transporters closer to my cell center. They call it the hunter-gatherer gene phenotype, I guess, where or genotype. I basically keep glucose higher in my bloodstream for longer. It actually spares glucose. I'm guessing just because we didn't have so many high carbohydrate options available to us in our primordial past, and you would go for a long time without ever having any carbs really. And I mean, I think anybody knows this, right? If you walk out into your local forest and you look around, how many carbs are there to eat? There's really not much.
You'll be hungry.
Maybe some of the berries or something a couple times a year, and if they're not poisonous, there's maybe some plants that you can eat, some green ones that aren't, if they're not poisonous. But there's not big potatoes out there. There's not, if you find a wild apple tree, they're sour and small, and again, only a short time of the year. You're not going out and harvesting the grains out of the grass there. You're just not. So it just seems obvious to me that in our evolutionary past, we weren't eating anywhere near the amount of highly digestible, highly absorbable carbohydrates that we are currently. Even when we did start to do farming and things like that, though the sugar content in the fruit was less than what we have now, the processing of the grains was much more rudimentary than what we have now. And the absorbability and just the rapidity with which we take in these carbohydrates and spike our glucose is clearly causing a lot of problems. And I think even in our own kind of low carb community, we find that I think it's a big blind spot. I think a lot of people don't realize that they're having these glucose spikes even when they are eating low carb. Because I was eating low carb, but occasionally I still have a potato, right? Or a banana. I'm still within my low carb macros, but I'll still get a big giant spike.
Wow. Well, seeing the 2 weeks on the graphs, like the one on the right when you were on the high carbohydrate diet, that looks like the week of the Tour de France that I definitely want to watch because it's all the mountainous stages. That's really exciting and whatever. And I see the other side and it's flat. There's not those excursions. It's really flat. And so okay, those are the sprinter stages that most people would find a little bit more boring. I think it's all exciting. But anyway, it's so interesting. And what I loved about your presentation is you brought all of that up and you didn't conclude that everybody should go out and eat in a certain way. That wasn't the point of what you were doing. This is self-experimentation. You were showing what was happening with you. Therefore, I wanted to ask you the question, you, Darius, knowing all of this, where you are today, what are you taking from this information to guide your lifestyle decisions? What lifestyle decisions, ways of eating, are you going to take moving forward knowing this? Are you comfortable being in the category of lean mass hyperresponder? Would you like to bring your LDL cholesterol down by eating more carbohydrates every day, knowing that it might spike your blood sugar? How are you handling this information and what things are you doing moving forward?
Well, one thing I didn't say actually is when I very first got my lipids measured, I was in my mid 20s. And my LDL, even at that point, eating lots of carbs, was 179. So it was very high back then, eating lots of carbs. And even after a lot of these experiments, it doesn't drop it much. I just genetically have high LDL. So I'm going to have to kind of pick my poison, right? If I eat lots of carbs, I get a bunch of glucose spikes. And there was even a time period back, like right around nursing school when it started, maybe a little bit before then, where I was getting like this weird numbness sensation in my toe, I remember. And I always think back, I'm like, was I actually diabetic at that time and didn't know it? It's a high possibility. Pretty much everybody on my maternal and paternal side were diabetic. All of my grandparents were diabetic. They were all dead by the time I was 21. Um, they were, everybody was obese, had heart attacks, strokes, and diabetes. And it's obvious that I have the genetics for that. So for me, it's just, I clearly need to stay away from the carbs. More than anything, I need to keep my glucose low. For some people, I mean, I know people who eat carbs all the time and never see glucose go nearly as high as I do. And they're fit, healthy people, or even obese people, and they don't see their glucose go as high as mine does. So for me, keeping my glucose low is really important. I do strategies like, and Glucose Goddess has a lot of great info on this, but like eating, your vegetables and your meat first, and then saving your carbs till the end. And I find if I'm going to have carbs, or maybe I'm gonna, maybe I'm out with my girlfriend, I'm gonna have a dessert or something. If I eat the other things first and I eat a small amount of carbs at the end of it, I can even eat a pretty moderate amount and not see much of a rise, particularly if I go for a walk afterwards too. That's one thing that also brings my glucose down. So I've only recently gone into like being strict keto. So we'll see how that does on my A1C. My A1C still sits about 5.8 right now. Some of the other things I've tried are experiments with like some of the keto products out there. Like I drink these Zevia drinks and these sodas. Okay, so if I want a soda, I can have that. It doesn't do anything to my glucose. It's completely flat. I feel totally fine. And I've even done experiments where I went and got my labs done. I drank 2 Zevia drinks and then got my labs done afterwards to see, did it affect my glucagon? Did it affect my insulin? Nothing. Didn't affect anything. I've tried things like hero bread or carbonate bread and bagels to see if those have an effect. Hero bread did cause a pretty moderate rise for me, but carbonate, nothing, totally flat. I really think there should be more options out there for diabetics. And even though I'm not diabetic, I kind of have to live my life like I am one. And there are, like, I went to Sprouts the other day I was really, really craving a sandwich. I hadn't had a sandwich in a long time, but I can't go there and eat the bread that they provide. And I was like, hey, do you guys have the low carb bread? They're like, no, we don't. They have gluten-free bread, but they don't have low carb bread. And I'm thinking, there's a heck of a lot more diabetics out there than there are celiacs.
Yeah, good point.
Right? And nowhere do I go that have like diabetic options or low carb options. They have gluten-free options. They have vegan options. And you might know 1 or 2 vegans or one or two celiacs in your life, or anybody with like a gluten intolerance, but everybody knows someone who's freaking diabetic. Everybody, right? 10% of the population is diabetic. Another 30% is pre-diabetic. So why aren't these options out there for people? At Sprouts, I had to go and buy the carbonate bread and then have them, so I had to spend $10 on that and then have them make the sandwich with that bread. And, it was great because I got my sandwich. I was very happy with that. Bacon, turkey, bacon, and avocado. And again, glucose was just, I think, a little bit of a bump, and that was it. I really think there should be these options out there for people because, diabetics are people too. They want to go out and eat with their family members. They want to, enjoy life. And, they want to go to the ice cream shop with their grandkids. But you go there and everything's super sugary. There's no options for them. There are, there's starting to be more and more of these keto low carb products out there, but I really think that they should be marketed towards actual people with diabetes, because that's what we're up against. That's the biggest problem in our healthcare system. Yeah.
Well, I love that, man. What a cool way of approaching this stuff with your self-experimentation. You are the epitome of citizen scientist. I'm so glad you took the stage. I'm so glad we had a little bit more time than 14 minutes today to go over some of this stuff, because it's so important. And I think your point at the very end there, that there's more diabetics than there are with some of these other conditions, yet we bend over backwards for some of these other conditions, yet we just ignore the things we could provide for people with diabetes would be so important. I think that's a wonderful point. Darius, this has been an amazing conversation. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you in your work?
Well, I'm on I'm not super big on social media. I'm Merce_Darius on Instagram, and on Twitter, X or whatever it's called now, Elon. I'm Merce Darius on there.
We're sticking with Twitter. I'm holding strong. It's Twitter.
You know what? Yes, Twitter. And then on Facebook, I'm just Darius Sharpe. I don't have a big, again, I don't have a big social media presence or anything like that. I'm just kind of a regular dude that's just interested in this stuff. I don't plan on, starting a podcast, and, I'll let you do that because you're great at it. I honestly just like my job as an ER nurse. And I think I'm able to do the most good there with people, working with people directly. And I was telling people at the conference, I really love my job because I can take, like, people come in with their type 1 diabetic kid, right? Their kid's not gaining weight, and they're thirsty all the time. They're peeing all the time. They're like, what's going on? They bring their kid to us because they don't know what to do. And we check their glucose in their labs, and the kid's glucose is in the 500s. And, maybe or maybe not, they're in diabetic ketoacidosis. But I can go over to my computer and print out the diabetes solution, Dr. Bernstein's book, and I can go to the parents and give that to them. And then I can show them the YouTube documentary by the same name, Diabetes Solution, right at the point of diagnosis of their kid. I can give them the right info, because what ends up happening is they get put on insulin, and then the kids just keep eating a bunch of junk. But me being in the ER, I can go to them right at their first contact with the healthcare system and be like, this is the information you need for your child. And similar thing is, I can, I have a type 2 patient that comes in with their sugars all over the place, and they're drinking juice all the time. And I can explain to them, you should not be doing this. This is why your glucose is high. And I feel like I'm able to do so much good there at the bedside, one-on-one with patients. And like, that's really what drives me. And
dude,
hoping I'm helping them.
I love that, dude. We all have a role in this, and whether you're listening and thinking like, I'm not in the ER, I don't host a podcast, I just listen to them, like, you have your part. You can help your family and friends and all these other people. If for no other reason, you could be an example. And I love your work. I will stay away from the emergency room. I'll keep doing this Dog and Pony Show podcast, and I'll do that. And you keep doing your part as well. I just so much appreciate all the thought you put into this presentation, and thank you so very much for taking the time to be on our show today. We really appreciate you, Darius.
I really appreciate it, Casey. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It was an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.